for joining us.
Thanks, Ellen, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for inviting me. I'd say it's nice to see everyone again, but it's at least nice to be with you again, even though remotely. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk to you about plants that are in the Aster family. And this is really a fabulous family of plants. This is
Marianne, let me just
Yes.
interrupt for a minute. I just want to remind everybody to mute, please. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I actually have one question about procedure. Are we doing Q&A at the end, or do you want to do questions throughout the presentation? Q&A at the end?
Usually we do Q&A at the end, yes, unless
Okay.
something is very specific for the time.
Okay, great. Okay, so anyway, today's topic is the Aster family of plants, which is a huge family. It has somewhere between 23 and 24,000 members of that family. So clearly we can't go through every member today, but we can at least talk about those groups of plants that are part of the Aster family and their importance. The only other family of plants that has more members is the orchid family, interestingly enough. And even here in the Northeast, we do have a number of members of the orchid family, but today's focus is the Aster family. There's so many members, and they're hugely important because of that, because they fill so many different habitats. They provide habitat, they provide food, they provide shelter for so many different animals, pollinators, birds, even people. So it's a really important family of plants. Food, shelter, medicine, all of those things are provided by the members of this family. So let's talk about the Aster family. What makes the Aster family unique? On the left of this slide, we have a bloodroot flower, one of the spring bloomers, sort of a classic flower, not an Aster family member. And on the right, we have an Aster family member. This particular photo is of a species called Aromatic Aster. So what's different? They look kind of similar. What's different between these two? What makes the Aster family the Aster family? Well, let's start by looking at, taking a more careful look at a classic flower that's not an Aster inflorescence or a flower cluster. Something that's similar to that bloodroot flower that we just saw. And if we start at the outside of a flower, the possible flower parts are the sepals, which act as bud scales before the flower opens. The petals would be the next sort of layer or row, whorl, if you will, of flower parts as we move towards the center of that flower. The function of the petals is typically to attract pollinators to come visit the reproductive parts in the center of the plant. The next whorl of flower parts in would be the male reproductive parts, the stamens, which consist of a filament tipped by an anther. The filament positions the anther to release the pollen, make the pollen available for dispersal. And in the center of a classic flower is the pistil or carpel. There can be more than one. That consists of a stigma, which is where the pollen must be deposited in order for pollination to take place, a style through which the pollen must travel to get to the ovules in the ovary in order to produce the fruit. So all of these flower parts are resting on a receptacle. All the parts for a single flower have their own receptacle, which is at the tip of the stem or peduncle for that particular flower. Now, how does this differ in an Aster family member? Well, in an Aster family member, think of what we're looking at, and we think we may be seeing a single flower, really is a cluster of many flowers. And that inflorescence is sometimes called a composite flower or a flower head. That flower head can consist of two different types of flowers. Ray flowers, which our brains are telling us are petals, and they are, but each represents an individual flower. Each petal-like thing there is an individual flower. And in the center are many small tubular disc flowers. Now, an aster family member may have flower heads that consist of both ray flowers and disc flowers, or just one or the other. All of these flowers in an inflorescence for an aster family member share a common receptacle. So that's different from what we see in a classic flower. And they're subtended by, the flowers are subtended by a common set of bracts, which are referred to as the involucre. You'll often see the word bracts in field guides because sometimes the color or the striping or the prickliness of the bracts act as identification clues when you're trying to identify a given species. So aster family members may have both ray flowers and disc flowers. And here we're back to the aromatic aster that I showed you earlier. And it does have a number of sort of violet or deep blue purple ray flowers, each of which is an individual flower. And in the center, there are a number of disc flowers that open gradually over a period of usually many weeks. That gives the plant and its pollinators a chance to do their thing over a period of many weeks. So the plant has many weeks to try to get pollinated to successfully reproduce. And also in partnership with that, the potential pollinators have many weeks worth of food. And typically, they start blooming from the outside of this cluster of disc flowers and work their way in. And we see a pair of little flower flies here. And I'm always entertained by the fact that they can be mating and eating at the same time. And it's usually the female that's eating, just so you know. So you can have both ray flowers and disc flowers. And typically in what we think of as classic asters, you do. But you may have just ray flowers. For example, dandelions, hawkweeds, all have ray flowers only. And disc flowers. You may have some species, there are many species that have disc flowers only. And that's the case with this example, which is blue mist flower. The word aster comes from the Greek or Latin and means star-shaped, just so that you know, and it's referring to the shape of the flower heads, the flower clusters. And there are many plants in the aster family. The classic asters like New England Aster, others that are sort of in that classic category are two that are near my heart because I have them in my shade garden: Bluewood Aster, Whitewood Aster. All the goldenrods are in the aster family. The sunflowers, the beggar-ticks, the coneflowers are all members of the aster family, and we'll see others as well. So we'll start taking a look at individual members. While fall is really sort of noted as the time for aster family members, the aster family members are not restricted to the fall. There are some that are early spring bloomers. For example, this particular species, which is a favorite of mine, typically begins to bloom sometime in early May. This is green and gold, also called Virginia Golden Star, and this is a member of the aster family. You can see that it has 5 ray flowers, and in the center, a cluster of disc flowers that again opens gradually over a period of several weeks. This is actually a great garden plant. It's a fairly short plant, probably doesn't get to be taller than about 10 inches. It's a good ground cover. It can tolerate both shade and sun. And if it's happy where it is, it really blooms for many, many weeks. Sometimes it can begin blooming again in the fall. Another early spring bloomer is golden ragwort. This actually has sort of heart-shaped basal leaves that are semi-evergreen. You'll often see them throughout the winter. And in the spring, the flower stems begin to emerge sort of a purple color. And as they open, the flower heads are yellow, again with yellow ray flowers, and in the center, disc flowers. Another nice attribute of this plant can actually tolerate either shade or sun. And in shady areas where you might see invasive species, it can actually compete pretty well with things like garlic mustard from reports that I've read. So that's another good thing to keep in mind. But this is another early spring bloomer that's a member of the Aster family. One more early spring bloomer are the Pussytoes. One species is Plantain-leaved Pussytoes. This species also has somewhat semi-evergreen basal leaves, and it has another interesting characteristic. It has male and female flowers on separate plants. This is a cluster of male flowers, which I always think look a little bit like a cupcake with birthday candles on it. But anyway, so those are the male flowers of the Pussytoes. The female flowers are actually on separate plants. So it's really helpful for cross-pollination, for to attract pollinators to come visit, which in the previous slide we saw a bee visiting the male flowers, and here we've got a fly visiting the female flowers. Ideally, you have the same pollinator visiting both and carrying the pollen from one species to the other, but you can see that the flowers do attract a variety of potential pollinators. The Pussytoes are also food plants for the caterpillars of the American lady butterfly. There is a later summer bloomer that also is a food plant for the American lady. The hawkweeds and cynthia and fleabanes are all early summer bloomers typically, although fleabanes seem to go throughout much of the summer. And they're all members of the Aster family. Some have just ray flowers like the hawkweeds. Some have both ray flowers and disc flowers like the fleabanes. This is common fleabane with very narrow white ray flowers and a cluster of yellow disc flowers in the center of each flower head, being visited here by a couple of flower flies that are disguising themselves as bees to try to protect themselves from being eaten by predators. One thing I should tell you is that in the case where both ray flowers and disc flowers appear, quite often the ray flowers are just there for decoration. They do not have reproductive parts. They're just there to be part of the show to attract pollinators to the center of the flower head, to the disc flowers, which are many, many tiny tubular disc flowers that which is where the business of pollination is done and where the pollen and nectar are provided to the visitors. It's through the summer and fall that we see the most members of the Aster family. And this is typically where the Aster family predominates. It dominates the plants that are blooming. They're not the only plants that are blooming, but they're a higher percentage of what we see blooming. And among them are a couple of classics here. We have New England Aster surrounded by a field of goldenrod. Before we get to those classics, other species that began blooming a few weeks ago, and probably in midsummer. One really showy, gorgeous species is New York Ironweed. This is an Aster family member whose flower heads or inflorescences consist just of disc flowers, again opening from the outside of that cluster to the inside. And we see it being visited here by bees and butterflies. A big variety of pollinators are attracted to these gorgeous flowers. Another summer bloomer are the thistles, and in this case, field thistle. This is a native thistle. It's often confused with bull thistle, which is a non-native thistle. You can see that this also is a cluster of disc flowers only that opens up and is able to feed many different insects at the same time, all taking advantage of a different disc flower in this flower head or flower cluster. We've got a hummingbird moth, a bumblebee, and a honeybee, all taking advantage of this. In fact, this little bee back here is one that specializes on thistles. So without the thistles, we wouldn't have this little bee. And on the for the benefit of the plant. It's also going to be visiting primarily just these thistles, so it's going to be pretty good about moving pollen from one thistle to another, enabling reproduction. The thistles are typically biennials. They have basal leaves the first year. The second year, a flower shoot rises up, and you only see them again if they've been able to reproduce. Just to tell the difference between field thistle and bull thistle, they have very similar flower clusters. Field thistle has what I think of as sort of like a little stand-up collar or ruff of leaves directly below the flower head. And also, if you look at the lower leaves up and down the flower stem, and flip them over, the underside of those leaves is white and almost felt-like, but definitely white, which is not the case with bull thistle. So these are great plants. They attract lots of butterflies and the other insects that we've talked about as well. The blazing stars are all members of the Aster family, all with disc flowers only, no ray flowers. And this particular northern blazing star being visited by a monarch butterfly and one of the little skippers. The Joe-pye-weeds typically begin to bloom about mid-July, at least around where I live and visit, and they typically bloom well into August. These are pollinator magnets. Butterflies love them. I run a butterfly count at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, and this is one of the most reliable places to look for butterflies. There are several different species. Probably the most common is Eutrochium purpureum, which has purple at the leaf nodes where the leaves are attached to the main stem of the plant. But this is another species where, or another group of species, disc flowers only, clustered in small flower heads, visited by lots of different pollinators. Here we can see, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 butterflies just in this one plant. Actually, here's another one peeking down from below, 6. The bone sets, there are several species. Common bone set, Eupatorium perfoliatum, has leaves that meet at the middle of the stem, and it actually appears that the stem is growing through the leaves. So perfoliatum is describing that characteristic of the foliage. This plant actually has medicinal uses. It's thought to be able to treat dengue fever and other problems, other diseases as well. White snakeroot is a similar looking plant. This species, bone set's probably more of a sun to shade, part shade plant. White snakeroot you'll see growing even in a woodland understory, and it can tolerate sun. So it's more of a shade to part shade plant. Both have opposite leaves, as I mentioned. Bone set has sort of a rough textured leaf that meets, the opposite leaves meet at the stem and are seamless. They don't have their own stem separating them from the main stem of the plant. Unlike white snakeroot, in which the leaves are opposite, but they do have their own stems meeting at the middle. White snakeroot actually is pretty deer resistant. I've actually seen deer browse bone set in spite of its medicinal chemicals. But white snakeroot is pretty deer resistant because it's pretty toxic actually. It's known for its toxicity, and if animals do browse on it, cows for example, and then if those cows give milk, you could get sick or even dead from drinking that milk. That is what killed Abe Lincoln's mother, milk sickness, the result of drinking milk produced by a cow that had been browsing on white snakeroot. It took a while for that connection to be discovered and figured out. There are actually other species of bone sets that are blooming this time of year. One that is blooming now and is very common in meadows and natural areas is, excuse me, sometimes called late or tall bone set. That one has opposite leaves, and those leaves each have a stem to them. all pretty fabulous, pretty showy. Probably the most common that you'll see in meadows are Canada goldenrod, rough-leaved goldenrod, tall goldenrod, and lake goldenrod or giant goldenrod. All of these are species that you would tend to see in a meadow area. They have big clusters of flowers of stems of the plant. They may show themselves in sort of a plume-like arrangement, or they may be more elm-shaped. The shape of that cluster does not really help you distinguish the two. It has to do more with the characteristics of the leaves and the stem. Whether the leaves have parallel veins, like 3 parallel veins, or whether they have a single midrib with feathered veining going off to each side of that midrib. And some of the species, like Canada goldenrod, has a rough stem, at least in the upper portion. Solidago altissima has a rough stem all the way down. Solidago gigantea has a smooth stem, almost waxy looking. And Solidago rugosa also has a rough stem, but it has the feathered veining. The other 3 species have parallel veining on the leaves. You can see that they attract a lot of pollinators. They are really important food for pollinators late in the season. Some species you may see beginning to bloom as early as mid to late July. Definitely they begin to bloom by August, well into September and October. Typically you'll see the goldenrods blooming. They attract, here I'm showing you butterflies because they're so charismatic. But the goldenrods also provide food for many bees, lots of wasps, which I know wasps have kind of a bad reputation, but they're really good pollinators, and they help to keep other insects in check. Also some of the flower flies, beetles. There are many insects that depend on the goldenrod flowers for food, and there are other insects that depend on the goldenrod plant tissue for food. In fact, there are species of moths, flies, midges that use the goldenrods as the food for their larvae, and they use the tissues, the plant tissues, not the nectar and pollen that you would find in the flowers. We see 2 very common examples of galls here that are caused by insects that are using goldenrod stems as a place to develop. On the left, we have a midge gall, a gall that's caused by a midge. It produces sort of a floret of leaves. The insect burrows into the tip of a growing stem. That prevents that stem from growing up. And it's almost like it puts the brakes on. The leaves keep being produced, but they just sort of are all produced at one location. You'll sometimes see branching from below this rosette of leaves and around and up, so that the plant will continue to bloom, very likely. But it can't grow, the main stem doesn't grow straight up. It'll branch, it can potentially branch around that. And the presence of this kind of gall, and a gall, if you're not familiar with it, is a plant's reaction to being used, typically by an insect, could be another cause like a bacteria, as a place for food and shelter and growth. So the insect is developing inside the stem. It's able to eat the tissue inside the stem and will emerge when it's developed and mature. The presence of this gall actually adds to the habitat that goldenrods provide. Up to 60 or more insect species take advantage of the habitat provided in that little gall, amazingly. On the right, we have a different kind of gall. This is a goldenrod ball gall. This is caused by a fly that is developing inside that gall. When the fly is fully developed in the spring, it emerges from that gall, unless it gets eaten in the winter. Insects are a really important source of food for birds. And there are birds that have learned that these galls, and in particular the ball gall, is a potential source of winter food. So birds, even in the winter, are looking for insects to eat. It's protein, it's really important food. Downy woodpeckers and chickadees both have learned that they can get a great little insect meal here in the winter by pecking into the gall and eating the larvae inside. Interestingly, that gall can host other insects aside from the one whose presence caused the plant to produce that gall. There are other insects that are sort of freeloaders. They're called inquilines. They're also living inside that gall, eating the plant tissue inside that gall and developing inside that gall. There are some other insects that are predators of the insect that caused the gall to occur. So they may lay their eggs there, eat the insect inside, and then emerge when they're ready to develop, when they're mature. So there's whole little ecosystems in these galls that are present on the goldenrods. So they're pretty interesting. Some goldenrods that I view as particularly nice for gardens are showy goldenrod, which we see over on the left here. Sometimes you'll see it as sort of a single spike, sometimes a branch spike. The flower heads, and I should have mentioned that the flower heads on the goldenrods consist of both ray flowers and disc flowers, but they're pretty small. So unless you look carefully, you might miss that. The showy goldenrod, those flower heads are actually fairly large, bigger than what you would see on the other meadow goldenrods that I talked about, the Canada goldenrod, wrinkle-leaved goldenrod, and the others. And it's a pretty nice plant. This showy goldenrod does not really spread much through its root system, so it's not likely to take over your garden. It's big, it's tall, but not too tall. It's about maybe 4 feet. And it has pretty robust stems, so it doesn't flop over very much. And it's quite a nice garden plant. For a shade garden, wreath goldenrod is great. I have shade where I live. I have wreath goldenrod, and it's just beginning to bloom now as we speak. Another nice one for shade is zigzag goldenrod, which I don't have pictured here, Solidago flexicalis. It also is good in shade, and it's called zigzag goldenrod because of the fact that the stem zigzags a little bit, and the flower clusters can be found both at the tip of that stem and at the leaf axils, the place where the leaves meet the main stem of the plant. Wreath goldenrod has flowers sort of all up and down, at least halfway down the main stem of the plant, at the tip and at the leaf axils. It has very flexible stems, and women used to take a stem and create a wreath out of them, thus the name, which they could wear on their heads, thus the name wreath goldenrod. The stems are also often, not always, but often sort of a blue or purple hue. And so sometimes you will also see, as a common name for this plant, blue stemmed goldenrod. Another one that I kind of like, although this does by its root system, so you do want to make sure that you have space for it. So if it's a small garden, it doesn't just take over, is grass-leaved goldenrod. This has sort of flat flower clusters as opposed to the more spiky or plume-like or pyramidal shaped flower clusters that we see in many of the other goldenrods. These flower clusters are pretty flat. The plant itself grows to a height of about 3 to maybe 4 feet. And it seems to me to sort of behave pretty well, but it can spread through its root system and has a pretty robust root system. So if you're going to use it, be sure to put it in a place that has enough room. Stiff goldenrod, pretty tall, but also another nice garden plant, as is sweet goldenrod, called that because the foliage has sort of an anise-like fragrance. The goldenrods are pretty deer resistant, although I do see them sometimes browsing the wreath goldenrod a bit. Now, goldenrods also have a bad reputation. People start to have allergies at this time of year. The gold begin to bloom, and your people's eyes get itchy, watery, they start sneezing, and they think that they look around to see what they should be blaming for it, and they see goldenrods blooming, so they just assume that's what's causing their allergies, but it's not. It's actually ragweed that is blooming at about the same time, but has very inconspicuous flowers. So you could walk right by ragweed and not even notice it, and you wouldn't think to blame it. But that's the characteristic of a plant that is more likely to cause allergies. A plant with inconspicuous flowers that has not evolved to attract pollinators. Ragweeds are wind pollinated. Their pollen is very tiny grains. They're small, they're light, easily carried by the wind, because ragweeds have evolved to depend to assist them with pollination. The goldenrods and every other plant that has showy flowers has evolved to attract an intermediary to help them with their pollination. They can't just walk over and, chat up another plant. They need assistance in getting their pollen from one plant to another. And the plants with showy flowers have evolved to attract usually insects as their courier of pollen, to carry the pollen from one plant to another to achieve cross-pollination. Ragweeds are one of the species, as are the grasses and some of the trees, that have evolved to use wind as their pollination partner. And there are two species, common ragweed, which we see on the left, and giant ragweed, which we see on the right, which may be blooming at this time of year and may be the cause of those allergies. Even ragweeds, though, have their value in the ecosystem. They are native plants. They're not necessarily garden plants. We all make choices about what we would like to see in our gardens. They're not necessarily garden plants, but they are in the ecosystem. Many moth species and even a couple of butterflies utilize their plant tissues, their leaves, as caterpillar food. Many birds eat the thousands of seeds that are produced by this plant, and or the caterpillars, because insects are an important source of food for birds. So they're an important member of the ecosystem. They're just not necessarily one that we're going to be fostering in our gardens, depending on our choices. So I'm deputizing you. If you didn't already know, it's not the goldenrods or any other really showy flower that causes allergies. It's the wind pollinated flowers like ragweeds. Excuse me, the black-eyed Susans are, and their lookalikes, are members of the Aster family. And most of you are familiar with black-eyed Susan, which is a biennial. And so it doesn't have a long lifespan. If it's going to be seen year after year after year, it has to be successful reproducing and getting pollinated and producing seeds and producing new plants. There are a few other lookalikes that are a little longer lived. Probably the closest in appearance is showy coneflower, Rudbeckia fulgida var speciosa, which has very similar flowers and foliage, but is a somewhat less hairy plant. And it has a longer life expectancy. It's going to live for at least a few years. It's more of a perennial rather than a biennial. Another very similar flower, or plant rather, species with somewhat smaller flowers is Eastern coneflower, a close relative of showy coneflower. And this is a somewhat less leafy plant. The foliage is not as dense as you see on showy coneflower or black-eyed Susans. And then thin-leaved coneflower has smaller flowers, but many of them, this is a much branched plant, and so it may have flowers at the tips of each of those branches. It's almost bush-like in its appearance. It is short-lived. It only lives for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, but it reproduces freely, and it's pretty fabulous in that it blooms for a long period of time. I usually start seeing this bloom by mid-July, and we'll typically see it continuing to bloom into early November. So you kind of need space for it because it does get bushy. It can tolerate part shade or full sun, although honestly, I think I see it more often in part shade situations. But it's I really like it. So I recommend it. These are all great. The cone flowers are all members of the Aster family. Gray-headed coneflower is the example that we see here. It's pretty easy to identify. The receptacle that is the platform on which the disc flowers reside is sort of egg-shaped. It's kind of long and narrow and kind of egg-shaped. And it has yellow ray flowers that are sort of recurved from the disc flowers. And here again, we see the disc flowers blooming from the outside of this cluster to the inside, or to the tip of the receptacle. It's called gray-headed coneflower because when it's in bud and in fruit, this head has sort of a grayish appearance. When the disc flowers are actually in bloom, they're brown. So could have been called brown-headed, but probably not original enough. Very pretty plant. That gets to be pretty tall, probably 5 to 6 feet. Green-headed coneflower is one of my personal favorites because the disc flowers are big enough. They're quite distinct, and you can really see them individually. So it's easy for people to see and understand, look, there's a bunch of little individual flowers there. And as we can see, we've got multiple flower visitors, pollinators here. We've got an American copper butterfly and a bumblebee, both feeding on individual disc flowers on the same flower head. So lots of food is available for pollinators. I will tell you that when I first encountered these two, they were bickering, but they quickly realized that there was enough food for both of them, and they called a truce and just went about their business eating. Again, the flowers begin to bloom from the outside of this cluster to the inside. The ray flowers are just there for show. They do not have reproductive parts. The other thing that I love about green-headed coneflower is that every year I see goldfinches eating these seeds after the flowers have been pollinated and the seeds are produced. So it's a great plant for birds too. I like this plant a lot. I like a lot of plants, and I don't always have reasons. Sometimes it's emotional, but wing stem seems to be pretty sturdy, pretty resilient. It can get pretty tall. In its first year or two, the plants are shorter, and as they mature, they get to be more like in the 5 to 6 feet range. They can be even a little taller if they get a lot of sun. They have a few ray flowers, and they have a lot of disc flowers. Again, pretty big disc flowers that you can see and that insects feed on individually. There's a whole bunch of insects here. You can see how good the pollinators are at picking up and distributing pollen. This bumblebee has gotten through the assistance of static electricity and just her browsing all over her. So she's going to be using some of that for herself and possibly her offspring. But the rest of it will be brushed onto the female reproductive parts, helping to reproduce this plant, helping this plant to reproduce. This is called a wing stem because along the sides of each stem, there's sort of a leafy appendage that extends beyond the stem itself. This is a deer-resistant plant. It grows in lots of different habitats. It seems like it kind of, it does well in moist soil. You might see it if you live near the Delaware River or some other river. You might see it growing along the riverbanks or the towpath here, but you can also see it in meadows. I live in the Sourland Mountains, just on the very edge, and I dispersed some seeds in a shady area up here. The seeds they germinated, the plants are doing great and they're spreading, but not in an aggressive way, in a nice way. So, and this is a deer-resistant plant, so it's great. Helen's flower. I love these flower heads. They're just so pretty. They're beautiful. Again, we've got multiple ray flowers. Each one has 3 lobes, and they just look so dainty. It's just really, they're really a pretty flower. They comprise a pretty flower, with the disc flowers in the center, being visited here by a small butterfly called a sachem. It's got a couple of different common names. Helen's flower is one, a reference to Helen of Troy, which is also memorialized in the scientific name, and sneezeweed is probably the more common of the 2 common names that are used for this plant. not because it causes allergies, because the pollen causes allergies, but because parts of the plant used to be dried and used as a snuff. People would stick the dried plants up their nose. Now, anything you stick up your nose is going to cause you to sneeze. So it's not the fault of the plant, it's the fault of the use of the plant and the user. So it's not a plant that causes allergies. So the marketing folks are trying to call it Helen's flower because it doesn't have the kind of connotations that sneezeweed does. All of the sunflowers are members of the Aster family. The example I've given you here is thin-leaved sunflower, Helianthus decapetalis, which refers to 10 petals, which sometimes has, but sometimes there are more or less. So that's not a good characteristic for identifying this plant. But the sunflowers, all members of the Aster family. This is a species that can tolerate, I usually see in sort of a part shade situation. And if you come to visit Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve, it's a fairly common species along the exit road and near the new pond. The beggar-ticks are all members of the Aster family. We have 3 examples of them here. The genus for these is Bidens, which means 2 teeth. And I'll explain in a minute where beggar-ticks and Bidens comes from. I'm showing you 3 different examples here, probably the most common and showy of which is the one on the left, which is called tick-seed sunflower, which is commonly seen along roadsides, meadows, moist meadows. It does kind of prefer moist soil, and that's typically where you see it. This is a species that began in the Midwest and gradually spread its range out to the Northeast. So we now see it here quite commonly. There is another species, Bidens coronata, that looks almost identical to this species. The best way to tell the 2 apart is based on the shape of the seeds that you see, or the fruits. But it's much less common. That's pretty restricted to wetland areas only. So the one that you're typically seeing along roadsides is tick-seed sunflower, Bidens eristosa. One that we have on and off at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve is the one that we see in the center, nodding burr marigold, which has relatively small flowers, probably about 2 inches in diameter, whereas with the tick-seed sunflowers, the flower heads are closer to 2.5 or 3 inches. They look a lot like sunflowers. I should also mention, with the sunflowers, the receptacle on which the disc flowers rests is fairly flat, which is also the case with the Bidens, the beggar-ticks. The nodding burr marigold has opposite leaves, and they're toothed and relatively small flowers. Really inconspicuous plant, and one that can tolerate shady places, is called beggar-ticks, Bidens frondosa, which has disc flowers only. There's yet another species that's very similar to this in the floral structure, but it does have a few small ray flowers as well. That one's called Spanish needles. It has very lacy, that one has very lacy leaves. The tick-seed sunflower has compound leaves. So there's a few different variations on this theme. Now a word about the name, beggar-ticks. The fruit that's produced from these plants typically has little prongs or teeth or tick-like structures that are evolved to help disperse the seeds. They're evolved to hitch a ride on probably a mammal, maybe your pants, maybe my pants, as we walk and brush past the fruits. The plant that we see on the left has this was Spanish needles. It has very long fruits with 2 prongs at the tips. And this is the tick-seed sunflower with a broader fruit, again with 2 little prongs helping it to hitch a ride to disperse the seeds. So that's where the name Beggar-ticks comes from. And bidens refers to 2 teeth. Now, some of the classic asters. New England aster is probably the most classic of all the classic asters. The flower heads, the ray flowers, the color can vary a bit. Probably most often it's a deep purple, but it can also be sort of a pink magenta color. And the center disc flowers are typically yellow, but we'll also see them turn sort of a reddish color after they've been pollinated, which is a signal to the pollinators that that flower, that little disc flower is closed for business. Concentrate all your efforts on the yellow flowers in the center that are still open for business. And that's where this little sweat bee is browsing. Lots of pollinators are attracted. When I took this photo on the left, there were about a half a dozen different species of pollinators browsing here for food. Aromatic aster is one of my favorites. It's sort of like a shorter, bushier New England aster in appearance. The flowers, heads, the ray flowers are all sort of a blue to purple color. There are many of them because it's so branched. They're sort of like the thin-leaved coneflower, very branched, so there were many flowers. Same thing with aromatic aster. This plant is great. I love it. And it's called aromatic aster because the foliage has a little bit of a fragrance to it, which I personally don't detect that much, but apparently it's enough to deter deer. I did plant this at a garden in town where I live, and while the deer browse on the flower heads of the showy coneflower, they leave aromatic aster alone completely. This is a late summer bloomer. Probably the earliest you'd see it bloom would be late August. It might not begin to bloom until September and blooms well into the fall, probably into early November. It's attractive to many different pollinators, like the bees we see here, the butterflies we see on the right. And again, insects are so impressive in their ability to both eat and mate at the same time. There are a bunch of small white asters, and 2 of them that we see fairly often are Awl Aster, which is fairly common in meadow type situations, open sunny areas. There's another one called many-flowered aster that's also fairly common in open areas, meadows. They have white disc flowers, yellow ray flowers. One that's more often, actually you see in all different places. It's in meadows, but I also see it quite frequently in woodland understories. So it can tolerate shade or sun, is Calico Aster. And this species, Awl Aster, has leaves that are sort of awl-shaped or broader at the base where they attach to the stem than they are at the tips. And it's sort of open in its habit. Many-flowered aster, which I don't show here, but again has small heads of flowers with white ray flowers and yellow disc flowers, very densely flowered and densely leaved as well. Calico Aster has many leaves that are pointing backwards towards the center of the plant, again with white ray flowers, yellow disc flowers. And 2 species that are in my shade garden, blooming now in a garden near me anyway, is white wood aster. And this has been attracting the most fabulous collection of pollinators. I've got, in spite of the fact that it's a shade garden, I've got some butterflies, I've got lots of bees, I've had the most interesting collection of wasps this fall, some that are new to me. So they're really pretty cool. White ray flowers, yellow disc flowers, turning pink when the flowers have been pollinated and are closed for business. And here we see a sweat bee looking for food and helping this plant to be pollinated. Just look at how her body is covered with pollen, and she's collecting some pollen to take back to her nest. Blue wood aster. Oh, white wood aster typically begins to bloom in about mid-August and continues to bloom into early October. Blue wood aster starts to bloom in about the end of September and blooms into early November. And it has these fabulous sort of ice blue colored flowers that are attractive to many pollinators. You can see a bunch of little sweat bees feeding on the nectar and pollen here in the flowers that are open for business. Notice none of them are dumb enough to go to the pink flowers. They're going to the yellow flowers. And by the way, if you weren't aware, bees are red colorblind, so they tend to be less attracted to reddish colored flowers anyway. So it's a really interesting adaptation of the plants to choose this particular color change to signal I'm closed. So very interesting. Plants are so smart. And they're really good at manipulating the behavior of insects. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Bluewood aster is also called heart-leaved aster because of the heart-shaped leaves that they have. And again, you'll see butterflies, bees, flies, all kinds of pollinators visiting these flowers. And this was taken about the very end of October. So you can see even in my shade garden, I was still getting butterflies as pollinators, and the flowers are still blooming. So just a word, why are native plants important? They provide the food, shelter, and medicine all species need. Not all species are going to use the same species of plant, but these plants provide food, shelter, and medicine for all life, basically, including humans. Plants in general produce the oxygen we need to breathe, and they can help mitigate climate change by reducing air temperature, sequestering carbon. They produce oxygen because they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce oxygen as one of the outputs from that chemical exchange. They help the ground to absorb storm water. And I live in Lambertville, New Jersey, which was a town hit by severe flooding from Ida. So that to me is a really important characteristic of plants. And the plants that are native to the area in which you live are best adapted to survive and do well in the area in which you live. Also, having plants, and particularly native plants, instead of something like lawn, can help reduce the use of fossil fuel. And also by lowering temperatures, which trees are especially good at, that will help reduce fossil fuel usage as well, because they provide shade through transpiration. They cool the air. They can reduce the air temperature around your house by 5 to 10 degrees over just down the road a piece where there's nothing but sun. So use plants. I highly recommend them. And that's about it. I see we have at least a few questions. Oops. Here. I'll go back here for a second. I see we have a few questions. So Deb says that she loves white snakeroot. She stopped pulling it years ago and it's happily spreading. Deb, I confess I did the same thing. So for those of you who don't know, I may have mentioned this before. I live in a townhouse development. We were able to annex some of the common ground right next to our house because it was so shady, we couldn't grow grass. We put in a bunch of native plants. And initially I thought, oh my God, I better pull out the white snakeroot because somebody might think it's a weed. And I stopped doing that because it turns out all my neighbors really like what we did here. And, you know, so more is better. So yeah, and it does spread nicely. So does whitewood aster, has spread really nicely for me. Bluewood aster has spread really nicely for me. Violets do. Which butterflies use the ragweed as host? And is it just a fall bloomer? It is a fall bloomer. The butterfly, there's one species of butterfly that uses it. If we have time, I'll run and get a butterfly book because I don't remember. It's not one that I typically see around here. There are many more moth species that use it. And to answer the question about the chrysalis, do the chrysalises overwinter? Each butterfly, as you probably know, Shona, hi Shona, I didn't realize at first that was you, has a different strategy in terms of how to survive winter. Some survive winter as eggs, some as caterpillars, some as chrysalises, pupa and a chrysalis, and some as adults. And the butterfly, one or two species that use ragweeds, I'm less familiar with. So I would have to look them up. If we have a moment at the end, I'll tell you what, I'll just email you after the class. And it is dependent on what species they are, whether they survive as chrysalises or adults or otherwise. It is an important reminder that we should leave the leaves in our flower beds. I had a really interesting experience at a local nature center just down the road from me. I knew that red banded hair streaks used fallen leaves as their caterpillar food. But a couple of weeks ago, I was at a natural area down the road from me called Goat Hill Overlook, and I saw a red banded hair streak. Spent about 5 minutes on the ground. She did, not me, I just watched. Walking around, pausing every so often to lay an egg on decaying plant matter. So that's just one example of the many insects that would be living in fallen leaves in our flower beds if we leave them in the winter. Do not chop them up. Do not mess with them. Just leave them as they fall. And back to the question about whether the butterfly that would be using ragweed the chrysalis is not always on the host plant for a butterfly. That is the caterpillar food plant. Sometimes the caterpillars move away from the host plant, the caterpillar food plant, before they pupate and into a chrysalis. So it may be in nearby foliage on another unrelated plant. It may be in the fallen leaves or otherwise decaying plant matter at the ground level.